Several years ago now, I was at another church where I was a pastor on staff, and I experienced something that all too many of us are familiar with, and that is conflict. Yes, conflict happens in churches. It happens in the church. It happens in families. It happens in marriages. I know, I'm married. We have conflict. Big surprise, right? Let's not hide it. You know it's true. It even happens to the happiest of couples. It happens in relationships with friends, best friends, right? It happens in our places of work, with colleagues and coworkers, right? It happens on campus. It happens in our neighborhoods, right? With the people we live near. And conflict is one of those things that the enemy or Satan and those aligned with him will often use to cause disruption in our lives, to cause disruption in the church. And the early church was no stranger to such things. Just like the church today. Stick around long enough and you're going to experience conflict here in our little church. You may have already experienced it. It's going to happen. And although conflict is uncomfortable, although conflict may cause us to, want to avoid people or shrink back or, turn down the hallway when we see them coming, as a counselor friend of mine once said, conflict is always an opportunity for growth. And that's how John continues to contend for this little house church or collection of house churches, perhaps in Asia Minor, from a distance. Right? That's how he contends for the church this week as we look at his third letter, which might actually be his fourth letter, as some scholars consider the previous one to be lost. I don't want to get confused on that or debate that, but here John is writing a personal letter to his friend Gaius, who is contending for the church or churches in Asia Minor with him. And what's a little different about today's message is we're looking at a very personal letter meant to address a very specific situation. And so rather than looking at the truths we're going to uncover today as like all-encompassing for every situation, I want us to look at them as generalizations. Okay, in general, these things are good to practice when we experience or find ourselves in the midst of conflict. It's kind of like Proverbs, right? In general, these are good things. Doesn't mean it's every case. It's not an A plus B equals C always type situation. It's in general, right? These are good practices to have when we experience and it comes to working through conflict with other people, especially believers. We want to know how to contend for one another through conflict. That is so important as a part of the church, in marriages, in relationships in general. Because reality is, when we don't deal with conflict well, it can mess up a lot of things. It can just mess up a lot of things. And so in the church, we want to deal with it well so the church can be edified and we can grow and we can be built up together. This is what John does for us in his letter. Verse 1, it says, "The letter is from John, the elder. I am writing to Gaius, my dear friend, whom I love in the truth. Dear friend, I hope all is well with you and that you are healthy in body as you are strong in spirit. Some of the traveling teachers recently returned and made me very happy by telling me about your faithfulness and that you are living according to the truth. I could have no greater joy than to hear that my children are following the truth." And if we just stop right there, we notice some of the language that's been, characteristic of the other letters that John has written, using the familial family type language. Children, the lady, the church, right? Talking about remaining in love and truth and how they go hand in hand, right? It's very obvious here. You pick up at verse 5. Dear friend, you are being faithful to God when you care for the traveling teachers who pass through. Even though they are strangers to you, they have told the church here of your loving friendship. Please continue providing for such teachers in a manner that pleases God, for they are traveling for the Lord, and they accept nothing from people who are not believers. So we ourselves should support them so that we can be their partners as they teach the truth. And so just to summarize a bit of what's happening, right? Because John is at a distance, he's contending for the church by sending teachers, by sending emissaries with letters to these house churches or this house church. And in verse 9, we encounter the problem. He says, I wrote to the church about this. This might be that lost letter that we're talking about. But Diotrephes, who loves to be the leader, refused to have anything to do with us. And when I come, I will report some of the things he is doing and the evil accusations he is making against us. Not only does he refuse to welcome the traveling teachers, he also tells others not to help them. And when they do help, he puts them out of the church. See the problem? See what's happening? John is sending teachers, he's sending emissaries with messages to the church, as was typical in the days of the early church. He was sending them, by his own authority, with authority. And Diotrephes, who loves to be the leader, is not welcoming them into his home, where he's either hosting a church or, the church gathers, or perhaps, the church gathers somewhere else, but he's not welcoming them into his home. And it's in direct conflict with John's instructions. So the question is, why? Why is Diotrephes not being hospitable towards these teachers sent by John into the church? Why is he rejecting John's authority as an apostle, as an eyewitness of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection? And theologians and scholars put forth some ideas. One possibly be that he doesn't like the church governing authorities. He doesn't like the church polity, the structure. Who is John to be teaching us? Right? Notice all these guys have Greek names, right? You got Gaius, Demetrius, and Diotrephes, right? All names for our future children, right? We've got these names. And then there's John, right? So why are we listening to this guy who's not Greek, who's, from Judea, right? Who's somewhere off over here? Why are we letting him tell us how we ought to operate? What does he know? That's like a Yankee from the north moving down to the south and teaching people about Jesus. Why would we listen to him? Right? That doesn't make any sense. We're the church. We're here. We're present. We know better. We know our context better than John. Right? So maybe that's the issue here. He's at a distance. He's not one of us. He's not like us. We know a little bit more here. Remember it says about Diotrephes, he likes to be the leader. Others suggest that maybe there's a doctrinal dispute, like we're reading in 2 John. Maybe he's teaching something that he ought not to be teaching, right? And John's trying to share truth of Jesus with him, and Diotrephes, he's just like, nah, I'm not sure we're in agreement, right? And I think most people agree with the first case. It could be the second case. But either way, he's refusing to show hospitality towards those representing John, thereby rejecting the authority of John as an apostle. And if anyone in his church helps, Diotrephes puts him out, creating this environment of control, this environment of fear. And so John jumps in verse 11 and says, dear friend, don't let this bad example influence you. Follow only what is good. Remember that those who do good prove that they are God's children, and those who do evil prove they don't know God. Everyone speaks highly of Demetrius. Likely Demetrius is this emissary that's tried to come to the church that's been rejected, as does truth itself. We ourselves can say the same for him, and you know we speak the truth. Again, notice that repetition, the truth, the truth, the truth. Truth and love go hand in hand. And so finally, he closes the letter with, I have much more to say to you, but I don't want to write it with pen and ink, for I hope to see you soon. And then we will talk face to face. Peace be with you. Your friend here sends their greetings. Please give my personal greetings to each of our friends there. So you following me with what's going on? You got the setting, you got the situation. John is trying to contend for the church, which is going through difficult times as there are false teachers actively opposing the church, some from within, some on the outside. Seems to get more aggressive as the letters continue. And he's got important things to say in the midst of all this stuff that's going on. And you know, he's an eyewitness of the death and resurrection of Christ. He has got apostolic authority within the church, every church, even today, as we're reading his letters, right? Because the Word of God is authoritative in our lives. And Diotrephes seems to want to be in control, right? Seems to want to control the church that John is writing to. And this is the conflict. And I want us to notice how John handles this. Like, there's some key things here that I think are important for us to understand when we're contending for each other in the midst of conflict. Notice, first of all, he's gracious, right? He doesn't avoid the conflict. He doesn't just write Diotrephes off, but he contends for him. In his letter to Gaius, he writes how he continues to write to the church, right? And Diotrephes, and how although he won't respond or receive his messages or letters, he continues to write. Remember, there's likely a previous letter that we don't have, but he's continuing to write to this church. And it sounds like the intent is to visit face to face, to plead with him, to understand, even perhaps with Diotrephes. And what I've noticed, and probably even been guilty of in the past 20 years of ministry, is either avoiding people with whom I have conflict with, or just writing them off and not working through it, pretending the conflict, doesn't exist. That can often be our default. Am I right? We just don't want to be uncomfortable, so we don't talk about what makes us uncomfortable. Right? We just hide somewhere else. We just stick our heads in the sand and pretend reality is different than what it really is. Right? Let's pretend that someone who is actually causing problems or engaged in sinful behavior isn't really causing problems, or isn't really, engaging in that sinful. Maybe it's sinful, but it could be more sinful. It's not that bad. Or maybe, we have a disagreement. And so I, just don't talk with that person. I don't acknowledge them because I want them to know I'm mad, right? You ever pull that one when you're married, right? I'm not talking to them. This isn't what followers of Jesus do. It's not what John does. And to be honest, sometimes the conflict in the church, it does find its way back home. It does find its way into our personal lives throughout the week. Because sometimes we're in close proximity with those we may have a disagreement with. We may live with them. We may work with them. They may live in our neighborhood. Right? My wife and I both are in this church. And we live at home together. Right? Sometimes we have different ideas about ministry and how it ought to be done, or how certain situations should be handled. We have conflict. Sometimes it's personal with each other. And the temptation is to believe that it's better to just not deal with it and just pretend everything is okay because it's easier and it maybe keeps the peace. Now, if it's petty or if it's not that big a deal, maybe that's true. But for the most part, when it comes to conflict, you can deal with it now or deal with it later, and it's usually worse to deal with it later. Because when we have hard feelings towards each other, we tend to think negatively about one another, and the enemy likes to whisper things in our ears that person, you know them, they don't like you, they're mad at you, when that might not even be the case. They're your enemy, right? And that just festers, and that feeling, it just grows and grows, and that tends to be how we see that person and maybe how we treat that person, and then maybe a little problem ends up being way bigger than what it ought to be, especially if we're going and sharing that with other people in the church. A good friend of mine put it this way: you can either pay now or pay later when it comes to conflict, but it's always going to cost you more later, especially when it comes to conflict. And who knows, if you deal with it early on, maybe God will do an incredible work in our hearts and in our lives and in our church. And so when it happens in our home, like for me, we don't let it rest. Like Ashley and I don't let it rest. We work through it. Right? I know conflict doesn't happen in your home. It does happen in mine. Okay? Ashley sometimes will come to me, or I'll go to her, and more likely she comes to me, right? And says, we've got to talk. Right? We've got to talk about this. We've got to work through it. And generally we do, and then we get to make up, and I won't tell you about that part. But friends, it's because we don't avoid each other. It's because we don't write each other off. It's because we don't pretend, but rather we remain in contact with each other. Just being in the same room creates opportunity for the Holy Spirit to work. Even if we don't see eye to eye, right? We can at least say, I understand where you're coming from when we listen to the people around us. I might not agree, but at least I understand. And we can choose to work through it together. John is remaining in contact with Diotrephes. And I think when we deal with conflict and contend for one another through it, this is the key to remain in contact. I mean, you think of Paul and Barnabas, or Barnabas and Paul in Acts, right? And I'm not sure this is descriptive or prescriptive, but it's interesting, right? They get in a sharp dispute, and Barnabas takes John Mark in one direction, and Paul and Silas go in the other direction. And then we end up reading in a letter to Timothy in 2 Timothy 4:11, Paul saying, only Luke is with me. Bring Mark when you come, for he will be helpful to me in my ministry. It's like, what happened? Right? At first there was like this disagreement in this dispute, and now, like, hey, bring Mark. And I think it's because they remained in contact with one another. Right? That somehow they worked it out. Part of it had to do with them, we're on the same team. Like, even though we might disagree, we're on the same team. It's healthy in this context, and I would argue in general. Not always, but in general, it's healthy in the church, and it's how we can contend for one another. By just keeping contact, being in close proximity with one another. I mean, try work out your problems from a distance. That's often much harder to do. But notice the second thing John does, and this is what Burge points out, theologian. He takes comfort in Gaius. He takes comfort in a trusted friend who kind of knows the situation, but is a little bit independent of it. He's showing hospitality toward the people that John is sending, but he himself isn't, being put out of the church that Diotrephes is in, right? So he's kind of independent. He's not like threatened by Diotrephes. So he must not be a part of that particular church. And at the same time, John also isn't asking Gaius to get involved in the situation, right? He's not writing him these notes saying, hey, you need to take my side and you need to go fix this and you need to promote me and those kinds of things. No, he doesn't do that, right? He just continues to appreciate and affirm the support and hospitality of Gaius toward those he is sending. And I think what John is doing here in the midst of this conflict is incredibly important for us to notice if we're going to contend for one another in our own conflict. And it's almost like bringing in a third party. Okay, notice Gaius, he's a friend, right? Gaius is potentially an ally for John if and when he does confront Diotrephes in person. But right now, he's not asking him to take sides, right? He's just supporting him in the midst of the conflict. And we all need people like that. People who will support us in the midst of conflict, right? Someone who's going to be honest with us enough, not just to affirm our position or take our side, but somebody who's going to ask us questions like, what do you think is best in this situation? Somebody who's going to ask us questions like, have you thought about it from the other person's perspective? That might help us reflect and pray and maybe peel back the layers of a situation so we can have fruitful and beneficial conversation when the time comes, right? This appears to be Gaius, who has continued to be in contact with John, right, through emissaries and maybe even a previous letter. But when working through conflict, often it can be helpful to seek outside wise counsel, to have those people in our lives that are going to give us a good perspective that we can bounce things off of, right? Not necessarily that we're going to go to them and they're going to go to somebody else and they're going to go to them. We're going to kind of create this gossip circle. It's like, well, did you know such and such? And, we don't want to be doing that. You keep that circle small. I mentioned the situation I had in my previous church. And honestly, there were multiple times I experienced conflict, right? It was a great experience. Great experience. But in every church, in every family, we're going to experience conflict. So let's not pretend it doesn't exist. It's like, well, it doesn't happen in their church, or that must have been a bad church, right? Because they had conflict. No! It was a great church, wonderful people. But I did have some conflict with some adults. I did have some conflict with those on staff. I did have some conflict with students and other leaders. But what served me well then and what continues to serve me well now is having someone whom I know and trust enough to keep confidentiality and have an outside perspective whom I know will not just take my side, but will ask good, clarifying questions. I don't like to wrestle with things alone. Like John, I want to have a few trusted leaders whom I can confide in, whom I can maybe share frustrations with, who will listen and contend with me and for me for the sake of others, right? We all need people in our lives, right? Like that, who we can trust, who we can go to with struggles that we're having, and who will encourage us and support us, not necessarily affirm us, but encourage and support us in the midst of those struggles and difficulties. Because there's nothing worse than being alone in conflict and feeling like you're all alone and like everybody is out to get you against you and the world is against you, those kinds of things. And I would argue, as John is contending for the church in conflict, and there is tension between him and Diotrephes, I don't think he wants to lose Diotrephes. Think about that. I don't think he wants to lose Diotrephes, or he doesn't want Diotrephes to feel like he can't continue to lead, but rather he wants to find a way to work together. The church needs leaders. The church needs people to step up and take ownership. And Diotrephes is obviously a strong leader. And the church needs strong leaders. John needs people, this is blow your mind, John needs people like Diotrephes. And so he's going to continue to seek wise counsel and find support among faithful believers. And I wonder if when we find ourselves in conflict, do we see the people around us that same way? Do we see the good in them? Or do we only see what we disagree with? Do we only see the bad? Because I think it would serve us well as families. I think it would serve us well as a body of believers to try and see the best in one another. To think about the best in one another. To give each other the benefit of the doubt. To encourage and think positively of one another rather than maybe pointing things out we don't do so well and maybe we aren't the best at. Because reality is we can all be better. We all have to learn and we all have to grow. So why not cheer each other on rather than being critical? Rather than being negative? Not to say there aren't times we need to confront. Right? That there aren't times that we need to work through conflict, but as we're working through it, choose to be or see the best in one another. And sometimes, that comes about by confiding in another trusted voice outside the situation. That can just give you some clarity, that can just give you some perspective that you're not seeing. It's a fun message, isn't it? Right? Woo, conflict. Yeah. Seriously, though. As we look at John's closing remarks, and it's important because we all experience conflict. So important. We all have to deal with it, so let's talk about it. And we look at John's closing remarks. He says, it's interesting, I have much more to say to you, but I don't want to write it with pen and ink. For I hope to see you soon, and then we will talk face to face. And I read that, and it just seems like, man, John is committed. He's committed to this church. He's committed to Demetrius. He's committed to Gaius. He's committed to even Diotrephes. He's committed to this group of people. Notice everything he's doing. He's encouraging and continuing hospitality, continuing to send messengers and letters. Even after they're being rejected, he's being faithful, not just writing folks off. Oh, this is too hard. He wants to work together. And in all of it, he seems to have this humility in his approach. He seems to have this humility in his approach. He's not blasting or bashing Diotrephes. He's not calling him an antichrist like we see in the previous letters, right? John used some strong language in those previous letters, and yet in this letter, we're not seeing that, right? He's not calling him an antichrist, even though he's not showing hospitality toward his teachers and those carrying the letters, which assumes he's part of the church and not against it, not intending evil or harm, even though he is not modeling this good behavior that John is saying, hey, don't follow the poor examples, don't follow those who are ignorant or those ignorant examples, right? They show that we don't know God, even though he's calling them out and saying, don't do this, right? It seems like he's committed to work through this conflict, whatever it takes, and contend for the church from a distance or in person. And I can't help but think, what a healthy attitude. Right? What a healthy attitude. Not this me versus you mentality, us versus them, my way or the highway type thing. Because that's what we do in conflict, isn't it? Like we often see the other person as the opponent, and we paint them as the enemy. It's just natural. That's what we do. Even the people who are close to us, whom we're supposed to love, right? That's what we do. But John has has this sense of we're in this together and we're going to get through it. And I just think that changes things when we're working through conflict, right? My fault, your fault, probably mostly my fault, nobody's fault. We're going to get through this. We're going to get to the other side. It just seems like it depressurizes everything when we commit to work through it. Commit to work through it. Again, church, very much like a family. All through the letters of John, he's been referring to the church, as his children, right? The bride of Christ, the lady, and we see that here again. Families and church, a lot of similarities here. And Ashley's probably going to be upset because I keep talking about conflict in our home. So that's going to create conflict, but let's stop pretending it doesn't exist, right? Let's stop pretending we have it all together. And just admit it's a reality. I know you don't, but sometimes we fight. Right? I think I got hit in the head with a roll of paper towels one time. Right? I deserved it, 100%. That's fun, though. I'm not saying she's abusive by any means, okay? I need to clarify that. I get myself in trouble, right? But sometimes we have these disagreements. Sometimes we have these arguments, right? And I know it's bad, but sometimes I just like to push her buttons. Like, I can get her riled up. I know how. But we work through it. And we're committed to working through it. I remember one time we had this disagreement. Okay? And I wholeheartedly believed I was justified and right. Because when you have a disagreement, that's your position, isn't it? That's why you disagree. I am right. You just assume that you're right and the other person is wrong. And we were having one of these disagreements, and I walked away from the conversation like stubborn as a mule. No way. I am changing my mind. I am waiting for her to come to me, right? You know how that is, right? When it comes to apologies, I ain't apologizing until they apologize first, right? I'm not going to them. They have to come to me. You know what I'm talking about? Thank you for that honesty, Nathaniel. I appreciate you. It will serve you well, right? And I was having all these things going through my mind. And, isn't it funny how, sometimes you can think of Scripture to justify yourself? Like, you just nab that verse there and nab that verse there, and you just think, yeah, I'm in the right. I am just, and please don't judge me. But, I was thinking of some of these verses, right? And, man, I was going to be right. And here's what I knew. I knew a couple of things were true, okay? Number one, I knew I wasn't happy. Number two, I knew she wasn't happy. And number three, I knew that we couldn't leave things this way. And it's funny, because you know how sometimes you fight and you don't even remember what you're fighting about? That's silly, right? And yet, this is one of these situations, because I promise you, I don't remember what the issue was, but I remember how it happened. And so I'm thinking of these Bible verses that, I'm supposed to be the head of the household. I'm supposed to be the leader, right? She's got to come to me, right? Wives, submit to your husbands. Like in the just previous verses and letters, you're supposed to submit to each other. And I'm supposed to love Christ as Christ loved the church. Forget about that. I just pick out the one I need that supports my cause. And so I'm thinking of all these things. And you know how the Holy Spirit just whispers to you sometimes? He whispered, Tim, leaders go first. And I was like, crap. I'm sorry, I don't know if I should say that from the pulpit. I was like, oh, leaders go first. That means I have to go back to her. And I have to say, I'm sorry to her. And maybe I have to even admit I'm wrong, and get that out there. And I'm just hearing that voice. And I'm telling you, friends, there is such freedom in our lives, in our marriage, in our relationships, in our churches, when we know that we're committed to working through whatever conflict it is that we have, right? She's not leaving. I'm not leaving. We are in this together for good. We're working through whatever, right? We have to, because otherwise we're going to be unhappy and we're sticking together. And as a church, what a powerful thing it is to be in that kind of relationship with each other. Granted, again, reminder, we're speaking in general terms here. There are clear biblical examples of when people should be asked to leave, right? Like when they cause division and discord and refuse to repent and reconcile. And there are times where maybe we have to distance ourselves for a while, like Paul and Barnabas regarding Mark. And again, I would not say I'm sure if that's descriptive or prescriptive, but it's the exception. It's not the norm. And how freeing it is to know that we can speak the truth in love like we're seeing here. We can be honest with each other and speak truth to each other in such a way that it's loving and propels the church forward. We're better together. And how powerful of a thing it is when we commit to each other in that way, to say, you know what, I might not agree with you, but I have your back. We might disagree on some details, on some polity, some structure, some approaches, but we're going to figure out a way forward for the glory of God. Because you know what? We need the people like John. We need the people like Gaius. We need the people like Demetrius. I would even argue we need Diotrephes. We need each other, and we need to contend for one another even in the conflicts, because we know that God is working in us, on us, and through us. We need to be faithful. We need to not avoid conflict, but look at it as an opportunity for the church to grow and to bond. That doesn't mean we need to go looking for it, right? Get out our magnifying glass and I'm going to go find some conflict, right? Don't stir it up. That's not biblical, right? But we need to work through it. So we're going to end the service by gathering together, putting our hands in the middle. We're going to shout conflict on 3. Ready? No, I'm just kidding. We're not. We're out. Some of you guys are like, this guy's crazy. Okay? Nobody likes conflict, but we're going to work through it well. This last Wednesday, the staff and I were at a church fair on the campus of Southern Wesleyan University. And my plan was to have this table and maybe a sign and a dish of candy and some information about the church, and just let people come to our table and, hey, let me tell you about Welcome Wesleyan. And in our staff meeting, Pastor Angela was really concerned about that. She was like, I think we can do better. And so she comes up with this whole spinning the wheel challenge game show type thing where people are coming by our table, they're spinning a wheel and maybe winning a cup of Easy Mac or a cup of noodles, or they're racing one of the staff members in a Bible sword drill, or trying to compete for a prize by seeing who can do more push-ups than a certain staff member. And so people are just coming in the door and we're like, hey, you want to spin a wheel? And we're like, spin that wheel, spin that wheel. And we're just engaging with a bunch of students who come by. And after it was over, we were packing up and getting ready to leave. And there was a student who made this remark. They said, you guys look like you have a lot of fun. You guys look like a fun church. Like you actually enjoy being together. And friends, I'd like us to keep that in mind. We're supposed to enjoy being together. Right? We're supposed to be having fun with one another. And I'm not saying conflict won't happen, but let's keep in mind what happens on the other side of that conflict. Right? The joy and the fun and the excitement in that, yeah, it might be tough right now, right? Jimmy may be upset with Sally, but we're going to get through it. We're going to work through it well, and we're going to be closer together. We're going to grow, and we're going to experience a lot of joy on this journey together. And listen, it's so important. And let me tell you why. It's because there's a world out there that is watching. And when they look at the church, they often see that the church doesn't handle conflict well. Why would I want to be a part of them? They gossip. They nitpick each other. They're negative. Like, why would I want to be a part of a group of people like that? So we need to do this because we're the kingdom. We're representing Christ to people who need to know the fun and the joy and the blessing that comes from being a part of the body. So no, it's not a fun message, but it's a really practical message, right? Let's deal with this well. Let's have each other's backs. Let's be on the same page. Let's be faithful. Faithful to the truth, to what God